And hello again, this is Philip Steiger at thebest3d.com. One more time with another follow-up on this one here. I wanted to make a few more changes and enhancements to that, and also some corrections. One thing you may have noticed, there's some white dashes or dots showing up here, and that's of course because when I filled it with the pattern, or even with a plain color fill, I did not use the anti-aliased fill, and so it ended up actually finding a couple of areas where the pixels were not white or exactly along the edge, and so it wouldn't fill those. And we need to address that if we want the better quality on that. So let's have a look at how to do that. So I'm just going to simulate here what the scenario is. We don't need to really use that full picture of the painted fruit bowl necessarily with the frame around it. We can simulate that. Let's just use this rectangle fill tool. You know, this is a double tool. Basically the upper left corner will draw a outline, the rectangle. If I undo that, and then if you click the lower right corner, the lower right half of that same icon, it will do the fill mode instead. There's a couple of tools that do that. The oval, same thing. In the upper left corner, the oval will do something like this. But if you do the lower right half of that, it will be a filled rectangle. Okay, so let's go back and actually use that rectangle tool and fill it like this. So this will simulate our picture frame that we rotated. Now before the rotation, let's have a quick look at it here and zoom into it, and it's a very clean edge. Alright, so pixels are there, and the thing we want to do now is to simply go and, let's see, filter and rotate, right? We use the transform. And by the way, I indicated that there might be slightly different, a slight difference in rotation if you took that in the brush or if you take that in the canvas, in the image buffer, and that's not the case actually. It is, I stand corrected, it is the same algorithm. And so what you do, if we did a rotate like by 1 or 2, you know, one thing when you look at it in the zoomed up mode here, one thing that happens here, it's anti-aliasing it, right? So you end up getting this transition, and that's exactly what where the nature is. I think we also did a tile, there you go, so the edges of the picture were also white, but we do have this transition of colors that is no longer plain brown or white. It has something in between, of course, because otherwise it would make a pretty awful staircase, right? I mean, when you look at it at the normal 100% scale, it looks pretty good, but when you zoom into it, you can see that there are some pixels that are neither the dark brown nor the full bright white. They are somewhere in. In order to understand what's going on, when we go and select the color, let's say we go with green and we use the fill tool, by default the anti-alias checkbox here is not enabled. Alright, so when you click here, it finds any pixels that are white, and in the neighborhood of it goes out and spreads to others that are white, and as long as they're the same bright white color, it will go and turn it green. And that's exactly where the problem occurs then. There are some values, some pixels that are not exactly the same bright white because they gradually transition to the brown along this anti-aliased ridge. So in order to fix that, in order to get a better color fill, what you really want to do is, let's go and undo that, you want to check the anti-aliased mode. When you click there, it will take a little bit longer to fill it, but it will give you a much better transition. You will not see that white stuff anymore. And then of course there is another one that you can also use, and that's the tolerance. Let's do the undo. Even without the anti-alias, you could say, well, let's give it a little bit of tolerance and say I don't need to have it exactly the same white as here. And let's see how far it can go. So now what's going to do though, the difference is that it's going to find some non-white pixels that you can go into and gradually chip away at them, but it's going to do a different result in the sense that it still stops somewhere and just immediately decides not to put the green on it anymore. And instead, what we really want is an anti-aliased filling where we find the tolerance and also gradually add to that. So it does a better job even if you leave the tolerance at 0, right? And if you keep the anti-aliased on, then the fill will give you a nice transition where it's not showing the white colors anymore. Alright, so that was one item I wanted to add to this. Another item I wanted to add, perhaps for even more visual realism, is to give it a little bit of a perspective skew, a tilt. Imagine if this is the picture that's hanging on the wall and you want to give the impression that it's a big picture, you're standing pretty close to it, and it's got a heavy cord behind it. And it's hanging against the wall, so the upper part is kind of leaning forward, and the lower part is closer and touching at the bottom of on the wall. So in that sense, the upper part is kind of closer to you, and you should get a little bit of a perspective skew. The upper region here should actually be a little bit wider, or the lower region should be a little bit more narrow. And there is a transform filter that would give you the ability to to do a little bit of corrective skewing on that. Basically, something like this is what I'm talking about, right? So a little bit of a trapezoid look. And you could do this after or perhaps before you rotate it. Let's have a look at how to do that. So we start from this plain unrotated and undistorted rectangular flat view and go to the transform filter. And there's a tool called the rubber sheet. Okay, which basically lets you imagine this entire picture is on this rubber sheet. And now what you can do is either you can skew it in the upper corner, you can make it a little bit wider there perhaps, or you can take the lower corners and squeeze them together. So there's a couple of different ways to go about that. And it's very approximate here. You gotta give it a little try and experiment with that a little bit. But when you go with that, it's going to squeeze the entire image according to this shape. And of course, it doesn't know what to do with the side colors here. Should it be the same white? Should it be different? It just comes up with this primary color, I suppose, and that's okay. We can go with whatever your background color is here and pick that up as the current primary color, and then go with the fill tool and fill it in here. Right, and we're still using the anti-alias mode here in this case. So anyway, so now we have a little bit more of a skew that makes it look like the upper area is somewhat closer. And that's because it's hanging off the wall. Alright, so that was one other item that I wanted to add. And then there is also something relative to the difference between resizing through this method that we have used. That's the transform filter, right, where you can do a uniform scale. And if you instead were to pick that up as a custom brush, right, like so, pick that up and you have it as a custom brush, you can store it here to manage it and paint it or play with it. Well, one thing you can do when you look at the brush menu here, there is a resample option, and that one actually has a few more additional capabilities. One of them is, yeah, you can go to up to 2 times original size, but you're not limited to that because you can actually enter the values right in here. All right, so let's say you wanted at a really big, much bigger size. You could go to something like 3333, why not? Or you could also remove the constraint so you can make it actually a different aspect ratio, right? And then you end up getting a drastically different appearance for that brush. So that's another, perhaps a slight difference between doing the transform or the rescaling, the resampling inside the brush, the custom brush, versus doing that inside the image itself. Okay, and then there's also a couple of other filters to explore for even more dramatic effects. Let's take a look at one of them in particular. If you're looking for photographic realism, you want to look under the photographic filters, the soft contrast improvement, I just love it. It does some really interesting things. And of course you can experiment with these sliders and give it a little bit more or less of that effect. But the idea here is to give it a nice warm and soft look. And of course another one also, let's go, okay, keep that. Perhaps if there is too much of that, you can always go back to that interactive undo, go back to the prior stage or somewhere halfway in between. Let's keep it somewhere around there. The other thing that you could also do is take a look at the other filters that we have in the photographic collection, especially the light diffusion. Because you have some dark spots, some darker ranges there, the shades, the shadows. Let's go full 100% size. Let's move this down a little bit. But then you have some very bright area here because the spotlight is hitting it right from an angle. And so one thing we could do here is give it a little bit of light diffusion to kind of give it some blurriness. And that blurriness would be primarily where the bright areas are. So And actually the dark diffusion is an interesting one too. So if you look at that, I don't know if I have a selection mask. Yeah, let's go clear that. That will be better. Let's go redo that filter. And where is it? Light diffusion. There, that gives us a nice little hazy blur in this area. Dark diffusion, that actually sometimes works quite nicely if you want to give it a little bit more contrast. The dark areas getting to kind of add that contrast to it. But I'm going to stick with the precise light diffusion in this case here. Maybe go back to expand dynamic range a little bit just in case we overdid it. And there you go, there's another example. And perhaps one of my all-time favorite new filters is the 3D perspective. That one is available right here in the transform collection too. Let's have a look at 3D perspective added to that. What I really like about it is that you can use this either with the repeating tiling or without. So with the tiling, let's see what we get here. Let's say we want this to stay on the wall, but we're looking at it along the wall. So we have a whole range of these pictures on the wall. And you can also move it down a little bit or up, adjust the positioning of this. Let's say we did this like that. And then of course the other option is to say no, let's not repeat it and go back to just one picture here. Perhaps not that much skew. Alright, so that will give you a nice additional option for a different angle. Now there's some blackness around here that you may need to crop. You know, it's always good to have much more, a nice margin, much more picture than you really want to see in the very end. So let's give this, and then we'll go with the rectangle selection to kind of select what portion we want to use or keep. And crop to that selection. Maybe at this time we can also make it a little bit smaller. Let's go resample it. Just half the size for a quick one, or let's constrain it, and in fact here we have the resizing capability too when it comes to doing that without the constraints. So here let's go with let's see, 800, and there you go. So let's take a snapshot of that, store this image, and compare the two. Now this one's a different size. We've done some resampling and resizing since then. Let's go and take this one, but actually scale it in, scale to the buffer. Right, so here's one that we started from just a few minutes ago. And here's the one that we have turned this one into.